and welcome to the Westminster Institute. I'm Robert Riley, its director. Today, Westminster is delighted to welcome back Dr. James Carafano, who is Senior Counselor to the President and E.W. Richardson Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. A leading expert in national security and foreign policy challenges, Dr. Carafano previously served as the Vice President of Heritage's Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. He is editor of a book series, The Changing Face of War, which examines how emerging political, social, economic, and cultural trends will affect the nature of armed conflict. Dr. Carafano is a 25-year Army veteran with a master's and doctorate from Georgetown University. He joined Heritage Foundation in 2003 as a senior research fellow in Homeland Security and Missile Defense. He worked with his predecessor in producing a groundbreaking documentary film, 33 Minutes, Protecting America in the New Missile Age. Jim now directs Heritage's team of foreign policy and defense policy experts in 5 centers on the front line of international affairs. In his distinguished Army career, Dr. Carafano, a graduate of West Point, served in Europe, Korea, and the United States. His assignments included head speechwriter for the Army Chief of Staff. Before retiring, Dr. Carafano was executive editor of Joint Force Quarterly, the Defense Department's premier professional military journal. Along with his degrees from Georgetown University, he also gained a master's degree in strategy from the U.S. Army War College. He has taught at many universities, including as a visiting professor at West Point, visiting professor at National Defense University, and director of military studies at the Army's Center of Military History. He was fleet professor at the U.S. Naval War College. Today, we will be discussing the Heritage Foundation's 2024 Index of U.S. military strength and whether the U.S. military is up to its job. Jim, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for all you guys do. It's a terrific institution, and your work is awesome. It's a privilege to be here, and also privileged to talk about the index and the role we think it plays in public policy.
This is the 10th year of the index?
Yeah, the origins of the index are kind of interesting. If anybody's a student of military affairs, they know that really with the end of the Cold War, we really entered into a period of what do we measure our military against? What's the mission? And what force do you need to do that? And the reality is, I think since 1989, the force structure has been driven by politics, not really by strategy. And in part, the way administrations did this was essentially they define the threats and the needs the way they wanted to, and then they say, oh, we have a strategy-based force. And so if you look, we used to have something called the quadrennial defense reviews, where every 4 years they were supposed to report to the Congress on the force structure and how that matched up with the threats and strategies. And literally what every administration did was they just rewrote the requirements to make what they wanted to spend fit. And then we had other defense reviews, and one day, I got asked by a member of Congress, and they said, we get all these reviews, and we don't know what to measure it against. And I realized that the one thing that the U.S. hasn't had, we can debate strategy, we can debate force structure, we can debate spending, but we haven't had a consistent benchmark to say, well, are we getting better or worse? So we actually set out to create an independent, verifiable way of measuring military strength consistently year in and year out. So you may not like our metrics, you may not like what we use, but everything that we have is either quantitatively or qualitatively definable, and we measure it in the same way every year. So you have a consistent measure now over a decade of military capability. The other thing that's interesting is we looked at three things, because you can't look at military force in context and say if you're stronger or better. So if you think of a cage fight, then you're having a MMA battle, you can't just say, well, it depends on who you're in the ring with, right? So not only do we look at US military capabilities, we also look at what potential enemies have, and we look at the context and where they would fight. So the theater, what infrastructure is available to the theater, and also what potential allies would bring to the table. So that gives you a full picture of military context, because it's relative to the enemy, relative to your friends, relative to where you're fighting. The other thing that's unique about our measurement is we measure against what we used to call a two-war capability. And the argument for that is the United States is a global power with global interests and global responsibilities. So the notion that we could ever be comfortable in just having enough force for one theater or one conflict would be inadequate, because somebody else could take advantage of that. And indeed, if you look at today, we're already engaged in supporting Ukraine in one theater. We're engaged in supporting countries and keeping the sea lines of communications open in a second theater. And we're increasingly concerned about deterring China in a third theater. So we thought it was valid to say, can you do a 2 MRC 2 theater capability? Whether you like that idea or not, at least it's a consistent measure over time. And the third thing is which theaters really matter. So again, we've used military forces all over the world. We've used them for all kinds of missions, everything from disaster response against hurricanes to famine relief in Somalia. And when we said, well, what are the pacing items? And so we really look at the three theaters that are most crucial to the United States, the three things that really connect the world together and enable the United States to project power and protect its interests. And those are Western Europe, the greater Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. So we don't ignore Latin America and Africa, but we consider those lesser cases. And then we look at all the military capability. We look at the Army, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, the Navy, and now the last few years we've added in the Space Force. We also look at strategic forces, missile defense, and nuclear weapons. And everything we do has to be measurable. And it has to be measurable in the same way every year from year to year. So if you look at the index, there's like typically there's 500 or 600 pages if you printed it out, and literally thousands of footnotes. Everything is measured to something that somebody can have. So and it's all done with unclassified data. So as far as we know, and I'm sure this is actually true, this is the largest and most comprehensive unclassified assessment of U.S. military capability in the world. And there is not even a document that the Pentagon produces that's equal to the detail and the information that we have. So a lot of people may be familiar with IISS and their military balance they think every year, and there's some other surveys out there. These surveys are not at all equivalent to what we do. Nobody does what we do. And the other thing is we put it all out there. So every single bit of information, every footnote is available online for free. Matter of fact, some of our heaviest ISP usage is from China. So whenever we come out, we know that the Chinese, the usage just explodes, right? And so people from all over the world use it. And our argument is, well, hey, all of this is publicly available information, so we're not really telling anybody anything they couldn't find in a place. What we are doing is, I think, putting together in a very comprehensive and clear way. So that is what you get. And we've measured it exactly the same way every year for 10 years using the same data. And so it does give you a consistent measure over time of whether, relative to the threats and the missions you have, whether you're stronger or you're weaker than you were the year before.
Thanks so much, Jim, for that introductory take on the index. I would have to say the Pentagon wouldn't produce a document like this because the public affairs shop in that building would never allow it out. It's it's pretty grim, and also not to discourage our audience from going to the index, which Jim says is more than 500 pages. There's an executive summary at the beginning that's 25 pages, and it contains the gist of the thing. I congratulate you on taking such an unflinching look at U.S. military capabilities and rating them from very poor to good. The overall conclusion of the study is that we are not in a position, that is, the U.S. military is not in a position to fulfill its mission. It has inadequate equipment, inadequate capacity, and the pacing challenges from our prime competitors is making it worse every year. In fact, you have also another index that's put out by the Heritage Foundation, which is a 10-year perspective. The index of U.S. military strength, 10 years in review. So while there is perspective in the index, here is another Heritage publication that gives the broad trend lines, none of which are really in the favor of the United States. Let me just step back a moment and ask you, who is reading this and what kind of impact has it had? And do you come under attack for being a partisan institution in some way? Or does your audience accept this exactly the way you presented it, as a consistent, quantifiable look at the condition of the U.S. military year by year?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. And I should add, when we look at the military, we look at all the things that contribute to military strength. So we not only look at how many tanks and airplanes and ships and people do you have, we also look at readiness. So for example, one key indicator is how many hours does a pilot fly? You get below 100 hours for a combat pilot, and you really don't have, a trained pilot. And we also look at the age of equipment and modernization, and the stockpiles of how many munitions you have. So we look at all the things that contribute to that. I will say generally, it's been very well accepted. I mean, if you just look at the usage of the index, it's an incredibly large number, and it's from all over the world. It's not just in the U.S. So we had some interesting feedback. So when we first started the index, for example, we got angry calls from the Air Force, and they said, "We don't like your index. We're in much worse shape than you think we are." So they were jealous that, other services were getting lower ratings than they were. And so we've actually it has actually created, it did in the early years, some very robust discussion with the services about looking at what data we're using and enriching that. So that's been helpful. On the positive side, there have been things like when Donald Trump first ran for president, he gave one speech on defense policy. And it was basically, we need, peace through strength, rebuild our military speech. And it was entirely based on the Heritage Military Index. And the reason why I know that is because the guy that wrote the speech told me. So, and to Trump's credit, they did try to invest in some of the areas, particularly in readiness, to try to bump up some of those things. So I do remember every once in a while, particularly the last administration, we came out and we were, some Pentagon spokesman was asked about it. And he goes, "Oh, well, who cares about that?" He goes, it says we have to fight 2 wars. Well, that's not our strategy, so it doesn't matter. Well, that's exactly the kind of behavior that we're arguing against, which is you can just rebaseline to make success look like whatever you want to look like. I do think that the current tensions that we're seeing around the world have validated the notion that it's right that the United States has to have the capability to act in multiple places simultaneously. Otherwise, adversaries can take advantage of that. It is used a lot, if for no other reason because there's nothing else out there that delivers that kind of data. So it is really become kind of the de facto standard for readiness debates when people look at this stuff.
I'm sure it's widely read overseas, particularly by those who are not particularly favorable to the United States. And the kind of weaknesses it exposes is an invitation to be taken advantage of. One example, of course, this is going back a while, was Chairman Xi's appropriation of the South China Seas with the building of his artificial reefs and then militarizing them. And President Obama just pretended it wasn't happening.
Right.
Or said, we'll pivot to Asia, but he didn't have much to pivot with.
Yeah, so we have to, and this actually, if you look at the index, for example, this is one of the things that's really good for is, because part of the reason again what we did is we get this all the time. It's like, well, why are you spending all this money? Like, why do we need this, right? You hear it from conservatives and liberals, why are we spending this money on school buses, right? So what we try to do is say, look, here's what you get, and this is what it costs. So we do try to map, kind of how much you're investing and what are you getting paid for that. And I think that's incredibly useful. But you can look at things, for example, like the pivot to Asia is a very good example. People constantly say, well, we need to pivot to Asia, right? That's the real problem. We should ignore, other theaters. Well, first of all, we've already seen the reality of we've got 2 theaters already on fire here. So the notion that the United States could do nothing and just focus on one part of the world and defend its interests, well, I think reality has proven that doesn't work. And our thing, which says we need to be able to do multiple things, is the right approach. But if you don't like it, that's fine. It's still the measure that we use. But I think the other thing is, if you look at it, it shows just the reality of force structure. Everybody thinks they're a general in their head, which is fine. And everybody thinks they're a military genius, which is fine. But when you say, for example, let's pivot to Asia, okay, look at the numbers. First of all, Asia is primarily a maritime theater. 70% of our Navy is in Asia. Now, if we move the other 30% there, we literally couldn't do anything anywhere else in the world. So the Navy, if you look at the data, which is in the index, the Navy pivoted to Asia a long time ago. And if you want more Navy in Asia, you're going to have to basically build more Navy. The Army, 90% of the US Army is permanently stationed in the United States. So you can't really pivot the Army because our Army isn't big enough to actually forward position significant military forces in any theater. So we keep it all in the United States so we can go any way we want. So there's no Army to pivot. There's really not massive force structure to take out of Europe and put anywhere.
Well, what about, Jim, what about the significant Army presence in South Korea and also
tiny.
in Europe?
It's minuscule.
Well, 27,000.
It's 20% of, wait, no, it's 10% of the US military. And it'd be when you count active and reserve. And we do, because you should count active and reserve and National Guard because we use all those forces. Our Air Force is distributed all over the world, but we are literally the only country in the world that deploys globally with our Air Force. So it really doesn't matter where our Air Force is, it can move anywhere. And as a matter of fact, it's actually advantageous to have it spread around because you can get to places fast as you more access. So you can't really look at where the Air Force is positioned and talk about, pivots. And the Space Force is in space, right? So there really is no military to actually pivot. So people that say that either aren't looking at the numbers or they're just ignoring the numbers.
Jim, a couple of weeks ago, the Congress passed a defense supplemental bill of $20 billion with the idea of helping to reinvigorate the industrial base a little bit and catch up on munitions and the motors that are needed for various missiles and cruise missiles and et cetera. were you encouraged by that, that it reflects some cognizance of the magnitude of the problem, though 20 billion obviously won't solve it?
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, if people are concerned about our industrial base and the cost of things, the answer to that is, we have basically a private sector industrial base. Its size is to support the customer, which is the United States. If we're not buying stuff, they're not making stuff. And I'm not saying you should grow the defense base, I mean, the defense budget, just to keep the defense industry alive. It's if you want a defense industry to deliver and to deliver at a reasonable cost, the customer has to buy stuff. There's a reason why, car companies are not selling electric vehicles, because people aren't buying them. And so what's going to happen? They're going to stop making them, right? And the government can subsidize that, but that means we spend a lot of money on something we don't really need. In defense, if you want reasonable defense stuff, you have to buy stuff. So the strategy and this is me personally speaking, right, is sustained spending over time is the best way to sustain defense infrastructure, right? If it's like, when you graduate college, you start putting money in your bank account for retirement. And if you do that, a little money over time, eventually over the years, you're in great shape. Whereas if you wait until you're 65 before you invest, the cost of having money at retirement is just astronomical. What we tend to do in our government is we tend to do this sine wave thing where we blow a lot of money when there's a problem, and then we starve the military when there isn't. And what happens is, our costs of maintenance, of sustainability, of equipment, of arsenals, and the industrial base, they go up and down. And so, things want to be extraordinarily expensive. If we invested consistently over time, that cost would be dramatically lower. Now, having said that, we are in a situation because we had significant years of underinvestment. Well, first of all, if you look at the Bush years, that wasn't really investment. We spent a lot more money on defense, but all of it went to consumables. We burned it up in Iraq and Afghanistan. In the Obama years, we took a peace dividend on a wartime military. So we significantly underinvested, and you can see that very clearly indexed. We dropped significantly. Trump came in, 4 years of investment, things got a little better. Biden came in and went right back to underinvesting. And so now, if you want to say, well, we want to have sufficient military power so we can deter China and Iran and Russia conventionally, confidently, that requires a significant military buildup. That gets to a real serious problem that we have now, which is if you look at every military buildup that we've ever done, it was through deficit spending.
Yes,
yeah, and the problem now is we have a massive national debt. And so the notion of doing kind of the typical defense buildup, we'll just put it on the credit card, is going to be, and not, how do you do that without significantly exacerbating an ongoing problem? And that's a real problem for a president, because the only way you can really do that is to reduce federal spending in other areas to free up money for. And it's always easy to say, well, we'll be smarter, we won't waste money, we'll be more, all these things sound great. But at the end of the day, if you're not putting money in the accounts to buy stuff, you're not going to get there. And so if you're concerned about blowing up the national debt and rebuilding defense, you are going to have to rejigger federal spending priorities.
Yes, and I couldn't agree with you more that the stop-start funding doesn't work for consistent military.
But on the other hand, people say, well, how is this affordable? Well, look, if you just take the amount of waste, fraud, and abuse in the Infrastructure Reduction Act and the Build Back Better Act and the COVID Relief Act, that money essentially would have been a massive down payment on defense build. And remember, all that money, anything that goes into fraud, waste, and abuse, that's taxpayer gets nothing for that other than debt. There's no value whatsoever. And so it's not about, oh, we should be building school buses and not tanks. What you're doing is you're spending money on stuff that has no value whatsoever because it's just going to fraud, waste, and abuse. And you're not spending money on defense. And when people complain about the defense budget and defense spending and everything else, obviously, for example, you look at one of these aid packages and go, that's $60 billion. Oh my God, that's a massive amount of money. That is dwarfed just by the fraud in the COVID relief bill.
I think that there are, I don't know if you know Jeb Nadanner.
Sure.
Who was a colleague when I was working in the Pentagon. And so his reaction to this $20 billion supplemental, generally favorable, of course, but he says, quote, if the benchmark is against the calendar and the clock, we're still falling behind every month. And this can't go unnoticed by China, unquote. And of course, by others. So it's a broadly reported phenomenon that our industrial base has been eroded.
Right.
And the length of time it's going to take to restock on the munitions that we have given Ukraine to expend is sometimes as long as 5 years. Why?
Well,
because the industrial base isn't there to
right.
double production, and it costs a lot to get that capital equipment to double the capacity.
Well, it's two things. One is the number one defense requirement that we have right now is naval, if you're talking about deterring China. And a lot of the munitions for that have not been depleted because the kind of stuff we're giving to the Ukrainians is not the kind of stuff that we're going to use in a war with Taiwan. But having said that, those munition stocks are completely inadequate. So for example, the Japanese, right, which they buy F-35 for all kinds of stuff. The Japanese Air Force can fly 3 sorties and they're out of munitions. So we have a huge munitions problem, and we have a huge shortfall in naval force structure. And then the typical way in peacetime that we respond to this is, just cut money from the Army, cut money from the Air Force, cut money from strategic weapons. Well, that's not going to work, right? Because first of all, virtually every war that we fight today is joint. So even in a naval war, the Navy relies heavily on the Army and the Air Force and the Space Force. So it's like going to the doctor and the doctor says you have a brain aneurysm and a bad heart and blood cancer. Which one do you want me to cure? And the guy says, well, doc, you need to kind of cure all 3, because if you cure one and I die of the other 2, well, that's the problem here is you can't just say, well, let's build up the Navy and we'll just take money from the others, right? So it is a challenge of how do you sustain the force structure that we have and really put significant investments into arsenals and naval forces. And you can't just say, well, let's just buy a bunch of drones, or let's just buy a bunch of this, or let's just do cyber, or let's do that. Because the reality is as we've seen in battlefields like Ukraine, you can't do that, right? I mean, you still need armor and infantry and air defense and all this other stuff. So, and the other thing you say, well, allies should do more. Totally with you. Absolutely. Allies in Europe, allies in the Pacific, allies in the Middle East, everybody should be stepping up and doing more. Having said that, it's not like they should do more so we could do less. If we can get them to do more, it means the more that we have to do, we can close that delta. But we can't just send in the B team and think we're going to sit at home and they're going to defend our interests, because that ain't going to work. So they have to do more, and we have to do more.
As we know, our allies in Western Europe within NATO, they have eroded their industrial base to produce what they need, aside from also eviscerating the size of their militaries, because after all, in NATO, it's the United States that will save them. Apparently, some of them have been sobered up by the war in Ukraine and the Russian proximity to them should Ukraine lose. Now, by the way, the Air Force can no longer be upset by the index because it gives it a pretty good drubbing in terms of.
Oh yeah, we fixed that problem.
Yeah, I think that they'll be pleased in that respect.
Well, maintenance and training hours are really killing the Air Force.
Yeah, my son was a Marine officer and had two tours in Japan, which he loved. And when they would go on maneuvers, whether it was in Okinawa or near Camp Fuji, uh, he could see that the amount of equipment that needed to be cannibalized
Right.
to get in the field, so that some planes were stripped to give parts to other planes so they could get off the ground. And that had also an effect on regular, ground equipment.
It was called closet queens.
Yeah. Now on the naval shortages, which is again you hit pretty hard in this index for good reason. We're nowhere near the 300 ships that we need to have. Meanwhile, China has now around 400 ships.
Right.
So
the thing on the ship, just a point on the ship, because people always say, well, our ships are better.
yeah,
Okay, that's true. But a ship can only be in one place at a time. So you can have the world's best ship, but it can still only be in one place. So there is a point where numbers matter. And in the Pacific theater, I can't stress this enough, building up maritime forces is the single most important thing. And the European, it's different. I mean, a lot has changed in Europe. As you just said, a lot of European allies are taking this more seriously. But it's very, very different. We used to think that the way we were going to deter the Russians is we were going to put lots of divisions along the border of NATO. That's not true anymore. I mean, we've seen the Russian military, conventional military, is not really that great. It's been significantly attrited. And the other thing that's changed is, now that we've added Finland and Sweden to NATO, if you think about the Russians, where they get, let's say Ukraine survives and it builds up a sufficient military, you've got them, you've got the Poles that are rearming, you've got Romania on that flank, you have Finland and Sweden the other time. That's a pretty substantial block to the Russians. And so it's not about conventional forces on the border. The future of conventional deterrence is deep strike. So killing all that Russian stuff before it ever crosses the border. I mean, that's the lesson we learned from Ukraine. Kill everything before it gets to the border. You don't need 100 million more troops in Europe and American divisions and stuff. You need a lot of deep strike and all the stuff that goes with that. And you need air and missile defenses to protect your civilian population. And if those frontline countries can continue to develop the militaries, we're going to be fine. So that's different. In the Middle East, it's really about geopolitics. I mean, we've just created this mess for ourselves in letting Iran run wild. And so it's really not needing a massive additional military force in the Middle East. But it's really working in better concert with our allies about what we have to actually deter Iran. So as grave as it looks when you look at the numbers, these problems are solvable if you take them seriously. Because the one thing that's interesting, because obviously the three really pacing military threats are Iran, Russia, and China. And I know you can say, well, all of them, well, they don't match the United States. But if you add Iran, Russia, and China together as a problem, that problem set is as significant as the Soviets during the Cold War. But the one thing that all three of them have in common is they want to win without fighting. I mean, it doesn't mean they don't want to have wars, but they really don't want to fight a war with us. They really don't want to get into a conventional war with the United States. That is the one single advantage that we have. As long as the three of them fear conventional war with the United States, this is a manageable problem. But what that means is we have to have sufficient conventional military capability to actually deter them. And the strategic umbrella is important, but what makes the strategic umbrella valuable and actually serves as a deterrent is the fact that you can defeat an enemy on the conventional level. Because the one thing we've learned is if people can't win a conventional war, they're not going to start a nuclear war. So if you want your nuclear deterrent to be scary, let people know that they can't beat you up on the ground. So if you look at all this together, the challenge that the United States has, I mean, even if you look at the money, we're in a terrible fiscal situation from a government perspective, but we are an incredibly wealthy and productive economy. we can afford to defend ourselves. But we need two things. One is we have to we we have to have fiscally responsible federal policies. We have to invest in the things that we actually need. And this is really, really important, our allies have to do their part. We cannot babysit the world. And so in Europe, for example, people have to get over thinking it's either like free American security like we used to have, or Americans just abandon us. The reality is we're not going to do either one of those things. The ages of free American security, whether in the Pacific, in the Middle East, or in Europe, those are over. We can't afford to do it if we wanted to, and we're just not going to do that. On the other hand, we're not going to abandon anybody. So the reality is somewhere in between. We have to do more, and you have to do more. This is where we really need to get to serious strategy, serious acquisition, serious policies. Unfortunately, today, what we mostly have is, we used to say that politics ends at the water's edge, right? Once we get, and the reality is today is we have made foreign policy an extension of politics. So we have a government that cares more about exporting our politics overseas than protecting our interests. So it's more important than the defense relationship, and that's got to change. It's just that simple. If we are vulnerable, like having an open border, essentially giving all of our enemies an open attack menu into the United States, if we are vulnerable, it's not because our enemies are necessarily really getting all that much stronger. It's because we're just being careless. If you think about it you remember, like a company said, you have a fiduciary responsibility, right? You have employees, you have a company, you have products, you have customers. You have a responsibility to ensure that that you are responsibly exercising your duties to all those constituents. And yet we have a federal government that doesn't treat defense that way, that they don't feel like they have a responsibility to actually provide defense that is reasonable and responsible and adequate.
I agree with your excellent remarks about deterrence. That's a theory which our enemies also are aware of. I don't think the PRC wants a war with the United States. They, as you said of others, want to win without war. And how are they going to do that? They're going to do it, and they're trying to do it by building up their conventional, well, they're also building up their nuclear strategic forces, but
Right.
their naval and armed forces to such an extent that it would be clear to the United States or anyone else to engage in a war with China would be futile because they would win. So
Right.
why bother?
Right.
And that's the problem. The naval situation is compounded by the erosion of our industrial base.
Right.
We're only now producing, one submarine a year. We don't have the naval yards, should the money arrive, or the skilled workers to improve upon this.
Right.
There's an erosion in welders and other people who know how to do these kind of jobs. Now, when I just give you that one statistic, I want to contrast this for just a moment with the productivity of the United States during World War II.
Right.
We had a huge industrial base at that time, and the private sector was galvanized and also ordered to transform their production into military products. And so here is what they did, Jim. These are the production statistics from the summer of 1940 to the summer of 1945. They produced 141 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 507 cruisers, destroyers and destroyer escorts, 807, 203 submarines, 88,410 tanks and self-propelled guns, 257,000 artillery pieces, 2.6 million machine guns, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, and listen to this one, 170 aircraft per day, 324,750 aircraft over the course of the war. Well, yeah, we can't do that anymore. we can't even get to 2 submarines a year. So it's,
Well, I have to say though, it is a self-correcting problem. I mean, we do have an industrial base which is adaptive and will respond to the needs um of the customer if the demand is there over time. And I mean, we've seen, miraculous things they've done in short order, just for example, in munitions production, because there's a demand there. And if there's a sustained demand over time, the market, will respond. And in the end, this will outpace the Chinese, uh, and more to your point though, in some ways, it is easier to do what you just described from World War II. We had to take 40% of our GDP
right.
to generate that. We don't need 40% of our GDP. We have, but we have to put the demand signal out there. Otherwise, we're not going to sustain that over time.
Well,
If we want to build 5 submarines a year, there are lots of people that will get the workforce and build the plans to build 5 submarines a year. But the requirement has to be there. If there's no requirement, there's going to be no force structure. You would look today and say, why aren't the Europeans, well, and they're beginning to, why aren't they building munitions plants right and left? Because no government has ordered munitions. If you look at this billion or a million rounds that the Czechs, the Czechs are going to people that have artillery rounds sitting around and buying them. They're not investing in, munitions plants. I mean, there are some countries that are actually starting to do that, including the Ukrainians and the Hungarians, and a few others. But the free, we said the arsenal of democracy, it will absolutely totally deliver, but you have to ask it to deliver.
Well, Jim, as you well remember, and as I do, because I served in the administration, President Reagan addressed the American people,
Right.
made clear the nature of the threat under which we
Right.
were, as well as our allies, and said that our defenses had been degraded for a considerable period of time, and it was time for a major military buildup, and that would have to come in the budget. And you mentioned earlier that included a lot of deficit spending. But by 1984, the United States was spending 6% of its GDP on the military. And that did put sufficient pressure on our enemies that they were dispirited. And in the case of the Soviet Union, they imploded. Now, today we're spending about 3.4% of our GDP on the military, and that's below the 50-year average, which was 4.4%.
Right.
So President Biden has spoken about the threats under which we're
Right.
today. And then he puts out a defense budget that, because of inflation, includes an actual decline in defense spending.
So I mean,
there's a big disconnect there.
Right. There's 2 things on that. One is it's not as scary as it seems, because as you pointed out it does take time for the market to respond. So it's not like we could go to 8% tomorrow if we wanted to, because there's just not enough. Right. But what you have to do is get on the glide path and create the demand signal. So it's not like you have to deliver all that money today. But it's like a down payment in the future. It's like don't be freaked out that your house price is whatever. You don't have to pay it all up front, but you got to get started, right? And set that demand signal. So it's a lot more doable than people think. You don't have to go today from 3.4% to 6% of GDP, but you have to get on the path. That's the important thing. The other thing is, and the Reagan example is a really good example. Ronald Reagan did not get elected president to rebuild the Pentagon. But he was trusted. And so when Ronald Reagan went to the American people and said, we need to invest in defense, they did it not because they said, oh my God, the Russians are coming over. They did it because they believed in their president and they trusted him. And to your point, when you say, oh, well, there's these terrible threats out there, and then you put out a defense budget which doesn't reflect the reality of that doesn't engender trust. But the reality is the president is the commander in chief. The president runs foreign policy. Nothing happens at the Pentagon unless the president pushes it to go in that direction. For example, again, how could anybody be credible about the defense of this country and have an open border policy that leaves us more vulnerable today? Today, we are more vulnerable than we were actually on September 11th, 2001. That, to me, that's a real credibility issue. Yeah. So these are some real issues that I think people have to, and I know we're kind of running out of time, but to kind of take it back full circle, the reason why we put the index out there is we're not dictating what policy should be or force level should be or even how much we should spend, but we do argue it should be an informed debate, both for the leaders and for Americans. And so we put the data out there so people can and should kind of make up their own minds.
Well, what you do is really incontestable, as you point out, because they're hard numbers.
Yeah. Well, I think so.
Anyone can find the outside sources of pretty easily. I want to mention one other dispiriting thing that is revealed in the index, or reflected in the index, I should say, and that is the U.S. Army can't grow because it can't even maintain its current size because it has such a huge recruitment problem.
Yeah, and there's two reasons for that. By the way, the Army and the other services are making their recruiting goals for two reasons. One is they lowered the goals, and the other is they're spending a ton more on recruiting. But it's a shocking fact that 70% of American youth are not qualified or eligible for military service because of physical conditions and everything else. So we as a nation have to ask, what's wrong that we don't even have people who are capable of serving in the military. But it's also true to look at what the military is doing. We've invested so much money in the social agenda and all these issues, none of which are actually contributing to military readiness or capability. Having more of anything in the Army doesn't make you people keep saying, well, diversity is strength. Well, this is utter and complete nonsense. Diversity is politics. What makes a military stronger is having people that are capable of doing military stuff. That's all there is to it. It's just that simple. And we have, I believe, politicized military policy to an unprecedented degree, and it actually has gotten to the point that it's impacted on military readiness. It's impacted on the confidence in the military, and it's impacted on people having a propensity to serve in the military because, why should I join the military? That's just going to play politics. I want to join the military because I want to serve my country. And if the military is not a place to do that, I'll just go do something else. That's the problem.
Interestingly, in my son's artillery unit, more than half of the Marines serving in it were not American citizens. They were from foreign countries, most of them African. And they made very fine Marines. There was no question about that. So that, in a way, is a reflection. Even though the Marines are the ones who have the smallest recruitment problem, if one at all, people still want to.
Yeah, in fairness to the Marines, they're also minuscule compared to the others.
Yes, it's a lower number to begin with. There's so much to do and so little time to do it. There's two other things.
Not, and I know, like I said, I know we're out of time, but this.
No, we're fine on time. That's okay.
No, people have to get over this thing and say, we don't have time to fix this. I think it's the wrong way to approach it. This is not, if we want to solve this problem in the long term, we need to tackle this problem for the long term. So get started moving in the right direction and you can fix everything. If you do like what we always do is we call it a crisis, we throw $20 at it, and then we say we're done, we're going to be right back where we started, right? There's a difference between running out and paying $300 for a guy to patch your roof every time there's a hole in the roof, or just knuckling down and buying a new roof and then paying it on the installment plan. So this is not something that can be fixed with crisis management. This is something that can only be fixed by sustained investment and engagement over time by our leaders. And that's what we really, really need.
Let me mention one thing that wasn't in the index. Maybe because it's hard to quantify it, and that is our information warfare capabilities.
And that's why it's not in there. We
That's
made a conscious decision not to measure things we couldn't measure. So, for example, there's some covert stuff that and the cyber thing, there's just no objective way to measure cyber. And so that's what we're not saying it's not important. We're just saying if we can't measure it, we don't include it. But as you put, the cyber piece is crucial. Microsoft just announced that they're completely revamping the entire company's approach to security. This is a company with a budget that equals the Defense Department, because security in the cyberspace is such a massive issue. So I'm not dismissing the issue; it's absolutely crucial. But I can't measure it, so can't measure adversary capabilities either. So,
well, right. It's not a quantifiable thing in terms of its programs and its effects. However, the capabilities are quantifiable, even if you have the capabilities.
well,
And,
yeah, I
well,
mean, the problem is a lot of them are, a
just-
lot of the capabilities are covert, and you can't talk about those.
Well, but a lot of them aren't covert. And the United States used to have, as you well know, the United States Information Agency, in which I once worked, was telling our side of the story and undermining our enemies. We don't do that anymore. There is no U.S. Information Agency. Remaining institution that should be doing that, the Voice of America, has lost its sense of mission in that respect. And those capabilities were supposedly transferred over to the State Department, which doesn't do public diplomacy well. It does private diplomacy.
Yeah.
And
one is, you have to be able to measure inputs and outputs, right? So in other words, this is what I get for this, and this is what it actually delivers. And if you can't do that, the other thing is we just look, as you know, there's multiple elements of national power, foreign policy, and they all matter and they're all relevant. But I would say two things. One is they're not fungible. And you get this nonsense all the time. Well, let's spend more money on information warfare, and then we can spend less money on defense. Well, that's nonsense. They're two different things, right? So I think you have to measure them each in their own lane. And so this one's just on the defense lane. And as you know, how many employees are in the U.S. Information Agency? Well, that's not a metric that tells you anything. It just tells you how many people you're employing. Well, how many TV programs do they put out? Well, that doesn't tell you anything, because it doesn't tell you about the impact that they're having. So this is, as you know, as a strategist, this is you look at all the elements of national power and you bring to the table, which is one of the reasons why we look at the debt, for example, because our economy and the strength of our economy is an element of power that we have. But all these things are important. But what we tend to do as politicians is we throw money at the stuff we like, and we don't throw money at the other stuff. So we tell lots of money at green transition because that's going to solve the world's problems. But then we're neglecting, as you said, the real functions of the State Department, real Defense Department stuff. So,
well, I just give you one anecdote. When I went over to the Defense Department, and I guess it was 2002 or 2003, they were aching for certain things to be done, which really wasn't in the Defense Department's vision, which is because there wasn't public diplomacy undertaking. They wanted to do it. In fact, I wanted to do it, and we did a bit, and it just simply took about 10 times as much work to get the funding and field something than it would have at USIA, because that was its mission. But the sense of frustration that was felt, that it was an unmet need. That's all I want to say about that. And Jim, let me, the index is very clear that these numbers don't win wars. There's more than just how many tanks you have. And indeed, we have gone to wars where we simply had a mismatch between the mission and our means.
Right.
Iraq is a very good example. Militarily, it was a situation that was successfully dealt with by the U.S. military in fairly short order. I was in Baghdad, and when the announcement was made that we hadn't come simply to liberate the Iraqis, which was the initial mission on which we deployed, right? All of a sudden, we were going to occupy Iraq. We didn't have the forces to occupy Iraq.
Right.
And that was, so the inception of the disaster there was the change of mission without the means in place to achieve the mission.
Well, you bring up a really good, no, I mean, I'm just saying, because you bring up a really good point, which is the other side. It's not just about the elements of national power, what you bring to the table. It's the ability to actually formulate strategy and identify strategic interests and then match them to ends, ways, and means. This has become a lot. We've gotten lazy since the end of the Cold War. We haven't had a competitor we've forced to do that. But part of the reason why the current administration can run around saying, well, we're going to invest everything in green transition and, exploiting, liberal culture, and we're not going to do this other stuff, it's totally divorced. If you read their strategy, for example, it's not a real strategy, right? It's divorced from the cold assessment of what are your national interests, what is vital, what's important, what are the ends, ways, and means that you have available? How can you match them? And how can you come up with something that is suitable, will actually address the issue, that is actionable, that you can actually do, and is supportable, right? We don't do that anymore. Instead, we just play politics with these issues. And so you need a serious strategic culture and serious strategic leaders, not just in the Pentagon, but in State Department, White House, political leaders in the Congress, as well as an adequate force structure. And that's what deter enemies. I mean, again, I'm not a political guy, but just saying, I mean, part of the reason why the last president was effective was because our enemies feared him. That he said he was a peace through strength president, and he wasn't afraid to do that. He didn't want to do nation building. He didn't want to do regime change. He didn't want to fight endless wars. But if you messed with America's vital interests, he was going to smack you over the head. And they believed him, right? So it's both those things that really, really matter.
Jim, I'd like to thank you very much for appearing on the program today to discuss the U.S. Military Index for 2024, published by the Heritage Foundation, and for discussing whether the U.S. military can meet its match today. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Robert Riley.